Alrighty, well, it's time to get on to our class, okay? So we'll be picking it up on session 24, page 168 in your notebook. So let me just pause now and pray, and we'll dive into the material. Father, we just want to stop and praise you and thank you for the work you're doing in China through Evergreen and through Ariel Ministries. Thank you for his friendship with us and the fact that we can partner with him in this as well. So we lift up our class to you in the first regathering as we look into your work in the world as you put together the modern state of Israel. So we ask you to help us to absorb all this material and work in our lives as you work through us in the person of your Holy Spirit. So we lift the class up to you in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, we're at session 24, page 168. So let's do a quick review so we can remember how we got to where we are. We saw last week that when the modern state of Israel was declared, an unprecedented emigration of Jewish people occurred from the nations surrounding Israel in the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people moving into Israel from 1948 to 1972. Unprecedented immigration experience starting in 48. One of the more famous immigration stories comes from Iraq. There was almost 130,000 Jewish people in Iraq who became the objects of Iraqi persecution. And the Iraqis finally allowed them to leave. And they were flown out of Iraq on aircraft. The operation was called Operation Alibaba. And of course, here are some Iraqi Jews coming down an El Al gangway. The operation was also named Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, as harping back to the biblical story of Ezra and Nehemiah and people coming out, the Jewish people coming out of Babylon. Of course, Iraq is where Babylon is located today, and there has been a Jewish community in Babylon since 586 BC, and there was a strong one in Babylon during the first century as well. So here are some more Iraqi Jews coming into Israel from Iraq. Now, all these Jewish people that immigrated into Israel faced the same hardships that the Palestinian refugees faced. With thousands of people flooding into the country, they had to be housed. And so ma'abara, transit camps, were thrown up in order to house all these people. And in order to do that quickly, the first camps had to be tent cities, like you see here. This is in 1950, the tent cities. But unlike the Palestinian refugees, soon the tent cities became more solid housing, and then pretty soon the transit camps disappeared. And there are no more refugee camps or transit camps in Israel today. That's because all the refugees were absorbed into Israel. The Palestinian refugees, unfortunately, were kept in the transit camps, in the refugee camps, and they still exist today. And these people are still denied entrance into the Arab countries or citizenship in the Arab countries to which they have emigrated. And so they're kept in these refugee camps as a political tool against the state of Israel. But that's the only refugee population that has not been absorbed into a country to which they fled. This is the only time this has happened in the history of the world that I'm aware of. In 1950, we learned that Jordan annexed the West Bank area that they had captured during the War of Independence. And that is that area right there. No country, I think only one country in the world recognized this annexation. But notice, there is no state of Palestine in existence. And if the Jordanians wanted to create a state of Palestine, they had a perfect example, perfect timing to do so. But they never wanted to do that. And so, as you can see on this map, that is Jordan. What we call the West Bank today was Jordan in 1950 and remained Jordan for many, many more years, till 1967. Then we finished up by looking at the program, A Nation is Born, program number 2, which dealt with this time period, again hosted by Abba Iban. So that brings us now to 1956, page 168 in your outline. And the Sinai Campaign. Now, the Sinai Campaign is very, very important because it lays the groundwork for the future. And we'll talk about that after we get through this campaign. So we're going to go through it carefully. Very, very important war that Israel was involved in. All right, starting in the first paragraph. Question?
Just this last comment here, this Fedayeen tax, what is that?
A Fedayeen tax, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, okay? All righty. For the better part of 2 decades, from the summer of 1952 until the autumn of 1970, the history of the Arab world was dominated by Gamal Abd al-Nasser. And you have this picture of Nasser in your outline, President Gamal Abd al-Nasser of Egypt. He was the kingpin in the Arab world for many, many years. Now, Nasser was the son of a post office employee in Upper Egypt. And since his early youth, he was active in anti-British causes. You know, the British ruled Egypt at that time. The indignity of British rule was compounded by the military defeat in Palestine at the hands of the Jews. Now, Nasser was a military man at this time. For Nasser and other military officers of his generation, the Palestine debacle could be attributed less to Jewish steadfastness and courage than to the ineptitude and corruption of the Farouk regime. And I'm referring there to King Farouk of Egypt. Here's a picture of the king. He was the last king of Egypt. He was a dissolute and corrupt monarch. He deserved to be thrown out on his ear, and he was. But the fact that Egypt was soundly defeated during the War of Independence was laid on King Farouk. They couldn't admit that the Jewish community could actually, the Jewish army could actually beat them. So they blamed it on King Farouk. So Nasser and his fellow conspirators, including Anwar al-Sadat, broadened their following within the officer corps, and on July 23, 1952, they seized control of Egypt's government in a bloodless coup. In March of 1954, Nasser replaced Naguib as prime minister, as premier, and later he would assume the presidency of Egypt. Now, Israel was singled out as the target of Nasser's ambitions. In December of 1954, the Egyptian Minister of National Guidance announced that Egypt would never make peace with Israel. Remember, they entered into an armistice agreement, but not a peace agreement. Now, these developments took place at a time of widespread German, ex-Nazi participation in the Nasser government, and as a campaign of Egyptian organized sabotage was launched against Israel. Until then, Jordan had served as the principal base for marauding attacks on Israel's frontiers. Those are the Fedayeen attacks that we're talking about. But in 1954, leadership in the guerrilla campaign passed to Egypt. So here's a map of the area. Of course, Israel is in center left there. And up until this time, Fedayeen attacks, guerrilla attacks, primarily came from Jordan, out of the West Bank and from the Jordanian border. But now Egypt took the lead in the Arab world, and now the guerrilla attacks came primarily from the Gaza Strip and from the southern border there of Israel, with guerrillas crossing into the country. By October, Fedayeen squads, trained and equipped by Egyptian army units, were penetrating deep into Israel. Roads, bridges, water pipes were mined. Large quantities of equipment and livestock were stolen. Soon the entire development program in Israel's southern desert was threatened, and many of the settlers were leaving. And soon Israel found herself isolated. Now in 1955, Nasser began exploring the possibilities of obtaining military equipment from the Soviet bloc, and Moscow was entirely receptive to this idea. Moscow was prepared to exploit any opening to undermine Western influence in the Middle East. In August of 1955, Nasser was allowed to purchase some $320 million worth of modern weapons from Czechoslovakia. Now that's 1955 dollars. Who knows what it would be these days? 1955 dollars, 320 million. That's when $1 million meant $1 million. The quantity of war material involved was unprecedented by Middle Eastern standards. It included 200 tanks, 150 artillery pieces, 120 MiG jet fighters, 50 jet bombers, 20 transport planes, 2 destroyers, 2 submarines, 15 minesweepers, plus hundreds of vehicles and thousands of modern rifles and machine guns. Now, what does Egypt need with all that stuff? That's exactly what Israel was wondering. Why do they need all that stuff? Question?
Yeah, who would have thought? Did Czechoslovakia produce this stuff? Or did they
Well, it was the Soviet bloc. Yes, you know, they were part of the Soviet Union then. So yeah, they did produce military equipment. All right, in parallel treaties, Syria contracted with the Soviet Union to purchase an additional 100 tanks, 100 MiG jet fighters, and hundreds of artillery pieces and armored vehicles. Now, in December 29, 1955, Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev loosed a particularly tough blast against Israel. Moscow made no effort thereafter to disguise its hostility, repeatedly condemning the Jewish state in the Security Council and accusing Ben-Gurion of preparing for war against the Arabs. Under these bleak circumstances, the Israelis were reminded that the nation's security depended on its own reserves. The nation's limited resources dictated a military force based essentially on reserves. So the Knesset acted a comprehensive defense service law that established the legal foundation of Israel's citizen army. In the 1950s, mobilization was already an integral part of Israel's everyday life. In short, every Israeli was a soldier, either in active or reserve status. And that is pretty much the truth still today, down to today. Ben-Gurion's goal was nothing less than the transformation of Israel's defense branches into a unified, compulsory, professional, and apolitical military machine. As Premier and Defense Minister from 1947 to 1963, Ben-Gurion accomplished the task. In December of 1953, Moshe Dayan was assigned as the Chief of Staff of the Army. And under his leadership, the Army became a hard-hitting, aggressive force. For Dayan, the emphasis was on striking power. All planning was geared to surprise, preemptive blow. A hard-driving, even reckless offensive aimed at breaking the enemy's morale. So Dayan put his philosophy of aggressive retaliation to work almost immediately. With Ben-Gurion, he was determined to prove to the Arab states that the cost of marauding and killing Israelis was prohibitive. Page 170. By the mid-1950s, the government's approach was to launch punitive expeditions against Arab villages harboring infiltrators and occasionally against Arab military strongpoints. The raids did much for army morale and training. However, the cost of world opinion, it cost a lot in world opinion and in repeated UN censure. Very high cost. In 1953, the Egyptian Coast Guard unit at Ras Nasrani had closed off Israeli shipping through the Straits of Tiran. So any ship flying the Israeli flag was not allowed to go through the Straits of Tiran. Now here's a map of the area. Here, of course, is Israel in the center of our map. To the south of Israel is the Sinai Peninsula. And then we're going to go down to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, right down here. And here's a close-up. This is a map of the southern tip, and this is the area we're talking about. On the left side of the screen is the Sinai Peninsula. On the right, there's the little island of Tiran. And between the peninsula and the island of Tiran is the Tiran Straits. Ras Nasrani, you can see on the map, you have this map on page 170, is where the guns were located that guarded that narrow passageway. And Sharm el-Sheikh is the major city in that area. So this was the area that Egypt initially blockaded to Israeli shipping. But in September of 1955, the Egyptians similarly turned back vessels of other nations bound for Israel's port of Eilat. So before, it was just Israeli shipping that couldn't get through. Now it's all shipping that is now not allowed to get through. So there's no way for any kind of goods to come into Israel through that port. So Ben-Gurion, on October 22nd, 1953, ordered Dayan to make preparations for capturing the Straits of Tiran. By 1955, Israel managed to only organize its defense establishment, not only to organize its defense establishment, but to acquire some 200 tanks and 200 planes. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but most of these were obsolete British and American equipment. They were insufficient both in quality and in quantity. Now, the Czech arms deal that the Egyptians had entered into threatened to give the Arabs a weapons superiority of 6-to-1. 6 tanks to every 1 tank that Israel had, etc. So now France became Israel's principal supplier of arms, and she received military supplies from France. Nasser then issued his challenge. Ironically, the West's break with Cairo was precipitated over a matter entirely related to local Egyptian economic development, which was the Aswan High Dam on the Nile. On May 16, 1956, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry announced its recognition of Communist China. The following month, of course, remember, this is the Cold War, you guys. This is the Cold War time. The following month, Soviet Foreign Minister Dmitry Shapilov appeared in Cairo to offer an interest-free loan of $120 million. This sequence of events was too much for Washington. Nasser was clearly playing one side against the other, the West against the East, us against them. In July 19, 1956, the United States retracted its offer of funds to help build the Aswan Dam. Now, Nasser had anticipated the Western reaction and intended to use cancellation of the loan as his pretext for nationalizing the Suez Canal. Accordingly, on July 26, Nasser proceeded to drop his bombshell. The Suez Canal was being nationalized, and its future revenues would be applied to the construction of the Aswan Dam. That night there was delirium in Egypt. Nasser was hailed as a national hero. So his domestic position was made more secure, and his reputation was never higher in the Arab world. Now, Britain was most directly affected. Britain owned a controlling interest in the canal. Nearly a quarter, 25% of British imports passed through the canal. And 1/3 of the ships using the waterway were British. So again, let's review the Suez Canal. So here it is, located in that narrow stretch of land between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And so we go in a little closer here, and you can see the canal on the left-hand side. Artificial waterway connecting the two bodies of water. And this is not a casual waterway. It's a very, very important waterway. There you can see a United States a convoy of ships passing through the canal, and you can see it's quite large. It can take an American aircraft carrier. So this is no little tiny insignificant waterway at all. It's very important to world trade and to the nations of the world. But it was probably most important to the British. At stake was the British general prestige in the Arab world. So Britain was in no position to accept this affront. So at this point, both the French and British governments ordered their civilians evacuated from Egypt. And Anglo-French military preparations gained momentum. Page 171. Britain and France brought the issue to the UN, and the Soviets vetoed any meaningful resolution of censure against Egypt. As far as Britain and France were concerned, all peaceful recourse had been exhausted. Now on June 19, Nasser made his intention toward Israel clear in a public speech. And you have the quote on the top of 171. "We must be strong in order to regain the rights of the Palestinians by force." By force, an implicit threat. Abd al-Hakim Amer, commander-in-chief of the Egyptian army, informed his troops on July 15th, "The hour is approaching when we will stand at the front ranks of the battle against imperialism and the Zionist ally." Now, Ben-Gurion knew that he had to break the Egyptian blockade. He only searched for a decisive moment to act, and France supplied the opportunity. The French leadership was interested in a carefully structured two-pronged offensive against Nasser. An Israeli ground attack through Sinai would enable the British and French to paratroop assault into the Canal Zone itself. On October 2nd, 1956, Dayan revealed to his senior staff what was about. The purpose of the impending campaign was to wipe out the Egyptian army in the Sinai, destroy the Fedayeen bases, located primarily in Gaza, and to open up the Strait of Tiran. Now, the role Britain proposed for Israel initially was unacceptable. The first proposal was for the Israeli army to advance in great strength and on a broad front in the Sinai, and to mount a heavy attack that would threaten Cairo. It would be a real war, and then the Allied forces could intervene as the saviors of peace. Well, that was out of question for Ben-Gurion. His aim was simply to clear the Egyptians out of Gaza and to end the blockade of the strait. An advance on the canal, let alone on Cairo, was the last thing on the Israeli Prime Minister's mind. So Dayan counter-proposed that Israel would carry out a limited offensive, more than a raid, less than a war. An operation that would be interpreted as threatening the canal and justifying Allied intervention to safeguard it. France and Britain accepted the Israeli plan. The Israelis would strike first on October 29th, dropping paratroopers east of the canal, and they would announce the operation over the radio. Britain and France would then address a joint ultimatum to Israel and Egypt to cease military activity. Israel would accept, but would not be obligated to actually observe the ceasefire until its troops advanced to a line 10 miles east of the canal area. Egypt would most certainly reject the discriminatory Allied conditions. Page 172. So at this point, the British and French air forces would attack the Egyptian airfields. They would destroy Nasser's planes on the ground. That would remove all fear of Israeli cities being bombed, and simultaneously eliminate any threat against Anglo-French landings. Finally, the Allies would land along the canal and seize the waterway. The plans are all set. How would they work out? You'll find out after the break. So take a 10-minute break and listen for the shofar, and we'll come back and see how the operation in 1956 unrolls. Alrighty, let's pick it up on page 172. The plans are set. France and Britain and Israel are all set. So we're ready to start this plan into operation. At this moment, this is the second paragraph down. At this moment, the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution, with its suppression by invading Soviet forces, had claimed world attention. Ben-Gurion was convinced that the tumultuous events in Eastern Europe would totally absorb the diplomatic efforts of both Washington and the UN Security Council. There would never be a more opportune moment for Israel to attack. So the operation was dubbed Operation Kadesh. At 3:30 p.m., October 29th, the 202nd Paratroop Brigade under Colonel Ariel Sharon moved into the Sinai. As Operation Kadesh unfolded, the Israeli government was obliged to lift its veil of secrecy. From his bed, where influenza had prostrated him with a 103-degree temperature, Ben-Gurion approved the deceptive announcement early on October 30th that, here it is, Israeli Defense Forces entered and engaged Fedayeen units at Ras El Nakeb and Quintilla and seized positions west of the Nahal crossroads in the vicinity of the Suez Canal. This action follows the Egyptian assaults on Israeli transport on land and seas, destined to cause destruction and denial of peaceful life to Israel's citizens. So just enough had been revealed to enable the British and the French governments to fulfill their part in the scenario. On the afternoon of October 30th, the British and French handed a note to the Israeli and Egyptian ambassadors demanding that their forces withdraw, respectively, to points 10 miles east and west of the canal. Israel, as planned, accepted the Anglo-French ultimatum. From Cairo, the response was precisely the one Israel and the Western allies had anticipated. Despite the panic-stricken entreaties of his generals, they said, "Don't do it. Let's have a peace agreement here." Despite the panic-stricken entreaties of his generals, Nasser rejected the Allied demand. And so, at 7 p.m. on October 31st, Allied jet squadrons began bombardment of Egyptian airfields near the canal. Ultimately, 200 British and French fighter bombers operating from carriers and from bases in Malta and Cyprus swept back and forth over the delta and canal fields, destroying the largest part of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. See, that's why the generals didn't want him to reject it. Eventually, British and French paratroopers did land and secure the Suez Canal. Now, Israel swept across the Sinai on 4 fronts. In the initial stages of the war, the opposing forces had been roughly equal in size. However, the quality of Israeli manpower at all levels was far higher. The officers led imaginatively and bravely and suffered half the army's casualties. You see, the officers in the Israeli army say, "Follow me." They don't say, "You charge." They say, "Follow me." And they often are casualties. They allowed nothing to stop their advance. At the cost of 180 men killed and 4 captured, of 20 planes and some 2,000 worn-out vehicles, Israel, in essentially a 100-hour campaign, occupied the whole of Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Page 173. Israel had shattered 3 Egyptian divisions, killed 2,000 of the enemy, and taken nearly 6,000 prisoners. Israeli forces likewise captured war material valued at over $50 million, including 7,000 tons of ammunition, 500,000 gallons of fuel, 100 Bren carriers, 200 military pieces, 100 tanks, over 1,000 other vehicles, an Egyptian frigate that had been trapped off Haifa by a French destroyer and then rocketed into submission by Israeli planes. Now, this map is on page 175 of your notes, and this summarizes the Sinai campaign, October and November 1956. And you can see the basic 4 lines of advance of the Israelis on that map. Oh, the reaction of the world. The world was outraged at Britain, France, and Israel. On November 2nd, the General Assembly of the UN approved the United States resolution for an immediate ceasefire and a withdrawal of all occupying forces from Egyptian territory. On November 4th, the General Assembly voted to create the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF. It would separate the combatants along the Suez Canal and elsewhere in Sinai. On November 4th, the Israeli government announced its willingness to accept the General Assembly ceasefire resolutions. The acceptance was conditioned on Israel's declaration of willingness to, and there's 6 items here, 6 very reasonable items. Egypt would declare a willingness to 1, accept the ceasefire, 2, end the state of war with Israel. Remember, she had a armistice agreement, but no peace agreement. Thirdly, to terminate all guerrilla activities. 4th, to enter into immediate peace negotiations with Israel. Let's get this thing going. Let's get a peace agreement going here. To cease the economic boycott of Israel. And number 6, to lift the blockade against Israeli shipping. All very reasonable demands. Now, initial UN efforts were aimed at extracting France and Britain. Eventually, on December 22nd, the last British and French troops left the Canal Zone. A new General Assembly resolution on January 7, 1957, demanded instant Israeli evacuation. The Israelis pulled back very grudgingly, and the UNEF forces filled the vacuum. On January 15th, Ben-Gurion announced his government's decision to evacuate Sinai completely. And by January 22nd, with the exception of Sharm el-Sheikh and the area guarding the Straits of Tiran. So here's another map of the Straits of Tiran. And here, of course, is the strait. This is the actual area where the ships would pass through between the island of Tiran and the Sinai Peninsula. Here is Sharm el-Sheikh. Israel chose to hold on to that territory. And Ras Nasrani, that's the area where the Egyptian guns were placed to guard the Strait of Tiran. So they decided, we're going to hold on to this area no matter what, even as Egypt doesn't like it. The Gaza Strip, likewise, would remain under Israeli control. Eventually, a formula was devised that put the UNEF into both Gaza and into Sharm el-Sheikh. The formula included assurance that the two sites would be, number one, garrisoned exclusively by the UN. Two, that the UNEF would safeguard life and property in the two areas and develop specific plans for coping with the refugee problem. And third, the UNEF would remain in Gaza and Sharm el-Sheikh for whatever length of time was required to achieve a permanent settlement between Egypt and Israel. Now, one of Israel's most devoutly cherished hopes for Operation Kadesh would remain unrealized. This was the fall of Nasser himself. The Egyptian dictator had emerged from his battlefield disaster with his prestige reasonably intact. He had managed to camouflage the awful shellacking his army had suffered at the Israeli hands under the reasonable evidence of Anglo-French bombardment and landings. They only beat us because the French and British were on their side. That was the way to save face for Nasser. There was little question that the 100-hour campaign had fulfilled its principal goal of advancing Israel's security. It profoundly enhanced the morale of the Israeli people themselves. The military lessons of the campaign, with its demonstrated advantages of preemptive attack, were invaluable. Fedayeen activity from Gaza virtually ceased. Israelis in the outlying border settlements could now work and sleep in peace for the first time in 7 years. The Gulf of Aqaba was open. It would stay open for 11 years. And those 11 years were all that was needed to establish Israel's trade relationships with the Orient, to inaugurate a series of pipelines that transformed the little republic into one of the major oil depots between Iran and Europe, and to develop an infrastructure that launched Israel on a period of its most impressive economic growth and diplomatic influence. From November 1956 on, by universal recognition, the Jewish state had established itself at last as a factor to be reckoned with, indeed a sovereign entity to be treated with prudence and respect in the Council of Nations. Now please note, we've gone through this carefully, but please note, this defeat of Egypt by Arab logic and national pride and Arab desire for revenge made the Six-Day War that is to come some 11 years later inevitable. Okay, the Six-Day War was now inevitably going to happen. Because again, the Arab culture is one of pride and humiliation and revenge and power. That speaks of some kind of similar activity. So we'll get to that when we get to the 60s. All right, page 176. Adolf Eichmann. On May 23rd, 1960, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion made an electrifying announcement in the Knesset. You have the quote at the top of the page. I have to inform the Knesset that a short while ago the Israeli security services captured one of the greatest Nazi criminals, Adolf Eichmann, who together with the Nazi leaders was responsible for what was termed the final solution of the Jewish problem. That is, the destruction of 6 million European Jews. Eichmann is already in detention in Israel and will soon be put on trial here under the Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law 1950. The words were received in incredulous silence. Can you believe the thoughts that were going through the Knesset members as they started to process that paragraph? And slowly, the members rose to their feet in a sustained ovation of applause and cheering. The announcement had culminated one of the most extraordinary manhunts in recent history. The search for the SS officer who had directed the Jewish section of the Nazi Germany's Reich Main Security Office, and who, in that capacity, had presided over a major phase of the final solution. And here is a picture of Adolf Eichmann taken in 1942 when he was at the height of his career. Adolf Eichmann. After the war, Eichmann had eventually made his way to Buenos Aires, Argentina, under a passport bearing the name Ricardo Clement. And we have a picture of that passport. This is Eichmann's passport into Argentina. Phony passport. A lot of the Nazis escaped to South America and Arab countries. And so they were aided with phony passports like these. Ricardo Clement, excuse me. In 1952, he felt confident enough to send for his family. The children, who had been small when their father left them years earlier, had been informed that he was dead, and they were told that he was Uncle Ricardo. Subsequently, Eichmann married their mother, and she became Mrs. Clement. In 1954, he joined the automobile firm of Mercedes-Benz, to which he was openly introduced and openly recommended as SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann in retirement. He was sure by then that the search for him was ended. And he was not entirely wrong. The official pursuit was over. But there were other hunters. These were the survivors of the Nazi death camps. One of them, Simon Wiesenthal, had founded a documentation center in Vienna immediately after the war and made it his life's purpose to track down Nazi criminals. And of course, here is that portrait of Simon Wiesenthal. You have it on page 176. He devoted his life to hunting down these Nazi criminals. It was Wiesenthal who managed finally to secure a rare portrait of Eichmann, page 177. Wiesenthal continued to pursue every scrap of information. Eventually, Eichmann was confirmed as living in Buenos Aires. It was decided to kidnap him and bring him to Israel. On May 11, 1960, he was accosted, speared away to an isolated villa. There he confessed his identity. On May 14th, he was drugged and transported to Israel. If you're interested in reading about that incredible story, this is a fascinating book, Hunting Eichmann, Neil Bascom. You can get it on Amazon.com. It is just an amazing book, because it is an amazing story. So if you're interested in reading about that, this is a fascinating book to get. Hunting Eichmann by Bascom. You'll enjoy it. Just incredible. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not going to be a spoiler. All right. On May 23rd, Ben-Gurion made his announcement first to the cabinet and then to the Knesset. On the very day of the announcement, Eichmann was arraigned before a magistrate in Jaffa. There he was charged with crimes against the Jewish people, war crimes against humanity, and membership in a criminal organization. 15 counts in all. 15 counts against him. That's all. Yeah. Eichmann was then returned to Ramla prison. The only country to demand Eichmann's return was Argentina. All other countries, one way or another, expressed their conviction that Israel would handle the Eichmann case fairly and justly. And the expectation was fulfilled to a degree that even surprised the prisoner. The Israeli authorities allowed him to choose his own counsel from any nation of his preference. At that suggestion, the suggestion of his family, he picked Dr. Robert Servatius, a distinguished 65-year-old lawyer on the Cologne bar who had acquired experience in defending war criminals at the Nuremberg trials. Servatius was allowed to bring an assistant counsel with him. The Israeli government paid all their fees and expenses. The trial began April 11, 1961 at Beit Ha'am, a large public auditorium in Jerusalem. Attorney General Gideon Hausner began his introductory address on April 17th. This is the introduction. The 8-hour statement included these words, 8 hours of introduction. This is probably the essence of his statements. I stand before you, judges of Israel. I do not stand alone. With me in this place and at this hour stand 6 million accusers. And of course, at the bottom of page 177, you see this very well-known picture of Eichmann on trial, standing in the little protective box, so nobody would assassinate him. All right, page 178. The prosecution cross-examined, submitted vast quantities of its own documentation, then presented innumerable Jewish and occasionally non-Jewish witnesses to testify of their ordeal and that of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And here's some pictures of the trial. Here are Eichmann's trial judges, Benjamin Halevi on the left, Moishe Landau in the middle, Yitzhak Rave on the right. So those are the three men to hear the trial and decide guilt or innocence. And here's a couple of pictures of some of the witnesses. This was a man named Israel Gutman testifying in Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. And just one other picture, this is a man named Abba Kovner testifying at Eichmann's trial.
These survivors?
These are survivors, yes.
Was there a jury?
No, they don't have jury trials in Israel. You always have a trial before a judge. Yeah. There's no jury trials are basically an American deal. You go before a judge. All right. The audience listened in horror, many times breaking down in tears, some of them fainting. Now, in his defense, Eichmann endlessly minimized his role. On August 14, 1961, after 114 sessions, the main proceeding came to an end. The court then adjourned for 4 months and then reassembled on December 11th to pronounce judgment. Eichmann was convicted on all 15 counts of the specific indictment. On December 15, Eichmann was sentenced to death. Eichmann appealed the verdict, and his case was brought to the Supreme Court, May 1962. This time the hearings were completed in 6 sessions. On May 29th, the lower court verdict was sustained. Eichmann then appealed to the President of Israel. At 8 p.m. the following day, May 31st, Eichmann was informed that his petition for mercy had been refused and that the execution would take place at midnight. At the gallows, he refused the black hood, and he sent greetings to Germany, Austria, Argentina, and his wife and family. And here's his he always minimized his involvement, his responsibility. And here is the summary of that. I had to obey the rules of war and my flag, he declared, before the trap was sprung. Eichmann's body was cremated, and in the small hours of June 1st, his ashes were carried aboard a police launch. When the vessel crossed the territorial 3-mile limit, the Prisons Commission dropped the ashes overboard. And so there's no memorial for Adolf Eichmann. No place to say he's buried here. Now, just a follow-up quote I ran into later on. From the Jerusalem Report, June 29, 1995. Middle East archaeology professor Ricardo Eichmann, 40-year-old son of Adolf Eichmann, hanged in Israel in 1962 in an interview with a German newspaper. I hate the Nazis. I'm glad my father is not with us now. When I think about the suffering he caused, then I would say, yes, his punishment was justified. So his son has his head screwed on correctly, doesn't he? I don't know how many children they had.
He was hung now?
Adolf Eichmann was hung. Ricardo is still alive. Yeah.
Going back to that.
Yeah. All right, National Water Carrier, 1964. We jump ahead now to 1964. Now, in the earliest days of Jewish settlement in Israel, no one doubted that irrigation was indispensable key to economic survival and growth. By 1960, therefore, Mekorot, Israel's water planning authority, had laid out the working blueprint of a national irrigation scheme. The budget for the entire undertaking came to over $175 million. No Knesset committee ever questioned it, for the Israelis regarded water as no less sacrosanct than defense. Now, Israel utilizes its water very efficiently. By 1963, sewage treatment plants reclaimed 90 million cubic meters per year, 5% of Israel's water resources. The purification of sewage was then followed by the Yarkon, Negev, Kishon Valley projects. So these three projects in general, I'm talking about all three projects in general, by 1957 had made 160 million more cubic meters available. So I know that I've got one date of 1963 and one date of 1957. I'm doing a little flashback there. The last phase of the master plan was the Jordan Valley project. The water would have to come from the Galilee rain area. Inasmuch as the largest proportion of this surplus flowed into the Jordan, the river would have to be tapped, the reserve extended by pipe and conduit through the Emek Valley to the coastal plain and from there to the Negev. Page 179. The first phase of the building was an enormous conduit traversing 2/3 of the length of the country, absorbing local water surpluses and replenishing local shortage en route. Lake Galilee, the mouth of the conduit, functioned as a semi-natural reservoir and was tapped during the warm season. The water would first be pumped into a tunnel extending westward to the lower Galilee hills. Subsequently, a huge concrete pressure pipe funneled the water on through the valley of Jezreel, boring through the hills south of the Carmel Range in a 4-mile-long tunnel, and then extending along the coast to the threshold of the Negev. Thereafter, large distribution lines circulated water throughout the upper quadrant of the desert as far south as Beersheba. Completed in 1964, the national carrier henceforth supplied the nation with an additional 320 million cubic meters of water annually. And you have this map on page 179. You can see at the northern end of Israel, the top of the map, the national water carrier begins in the Sea of Galilee. And it's an open canal down to Eshkol. Then from Eshkol, there's a pipeline, a tunnel through the Carmel mountain range, and then through tunnels down to down to Tel Aviv, Rosh Ha'ayin, and then all the way down to the Negev in the Beersheba area down there. So it's quite an amazing irrigation project. So that's our national water carrier.
Targeted in war?
Excuse me?
Is this canal targeted in war?
I'm sure it probably is. You know, maybe not. If the Arabs took over this, they would want that water as well. But you know, I'm sure it would be a possible target, definitely. All right. The 320 million cubic meters of water was a 25% increase in supply and a 75% increase in water for the Negev. The national water carrier revolutionized the possibilities for agricultural and industrial development in the northern sector of the desert. The communities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Kiryat Gat, Beersheba, and Dimona for the first time, were able to meet the growing water requirements of their new factories and municipal services. For Israel on a whole, the completed Jordan Valley project opened up assurances of employment for an intended population of at least 5 million people. Page 180, the PLO. The Palestine Liberation Organization is undoubtedly one of the most infamous terrorist organizations in the world. Created in 1964 during the Arab League Summit in Cairo, the PLO originally stated goal was the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle while seeking to destroy the existence of Zionism in the Middle East. And you have their logo on page 180. And of course you see the logo includes a map of Israel from the Jordan to the sea. We are going to take all that area. No Jewish state. That's the goal of the PLO. Now, it was not long before the group splintered into various factions, all of whom believed they knew the best way to achieve liberation for the Palestinians. The most notable of these groups were the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the DFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLP, GC, and the Fatah. And you're very familiar with Fatah these days, aren't you? Now, this is the beginning. While each of these factions were independently controlled, they all remained more or less under the umbrella of the PLO. By 1967, the PLO had decided that their primary goal was the destruction of the State of Israel. Over the next 10 years, this goal was the primary focus of the massive terrorist campaign by which their reputation was formed. The terror war caused hundreds of casualties on both sides with very little to show in return for the Palestinian cause. Therefore, the PLO made a conscious decision to alter its focus from one based purely on terrorism to one that would include the diplomatic and political elements necessary for a meaningful dialogue. The PLO's partial reversal on ideology created unhappiness among many of its followers, the more extreme followers, who felt the organization was not finding its mark. This led to the creation of yet another splinter group called the Rejectionist Front. Now at this time, Yasser Arafat and his group, Fatah, took over the leadership of the PLO. We'll talk about more of this when we get to 1968. Things began to change quickly when the PLO gained international recognition from the United Nations as the primary representative of the Palestinian people. Arafat deftly manipulated the organization from one perceived by the West as barbaric into one considered a freedom movement with legitimate claims. Israel, perhaps sensing the growing sympathy, redoubled its efforts to eliminate the Palestinian threat. All right, that brings us to the end of our time tonight. Next week, we will have a 1-hour movie. You guys always bug me. Aren't we going to have a DVD this week? Well, next week we will have a DVD. It'll be program number 3 from Abba Eban's documentary, Israel, a Nation is Born. So we'll pick that up next week. So let me go ahead and pray, and we'll turn you loose for tonight. Father, again, we do want to thank you for your work in the world as you brought Israel the resources she needed and the respite she needed in 1956 to begin to flower and mature and become a nation respected among the nations of the world. And Lord, we know you do the same with us. You provide us with the resources we need to grow and mature in the faith. And those resources and those experiences may be hard, they may be joyful, they may have a time of sadness, but we all know that just as you were bringing Israel to maturity, you will bring us to maturity in our lives. And so help us to trust you in that. And again, thank you for what you've done during the first regathering as you bring Israel to the point of being the navel of the world, as you say in the book of Ezekiel, the center of the world, which she will be in a few years. And so we thank you in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week.